So welcome to our discussion on hydrogen, technological and cost realities. Really appreciate you sticking around to the end. We will have a reception in the foyer after this, which is just outside the doors. I think you're about to be rewarded by three just outstanding speakers sharing their insights today on what's been going on with the U.S. as far as policy and wanting to build out the hydrogen industry. Leading off today will be Joanne Kilgour. She's the Executive Director of the Ohio River Valley Institute, where she and her team provide research and solutions for a strong Appalachia. Today she'll talk about the hydrogen hub development in this region, drawing from her talents as an environmental lawyer and nonprofit professional committed to securing social, economic, and environmental policies that support communities while demanding long-term structural change. Following Joanne, we have Reza. He's the principal engineer and office director for Exponent. Ali leads the loss of containment events, investigates the loss of containment events and large loss fires and with explosions with a focus on the petrochemical industry and gas utilities. He's experienced in evaluating the relationships between equipment design, automation, and operator decisions and practices, and in conducting risk and hazard assessments to prevent or mitigate LOC events, so loss of containment events. Today he'll be looking at the service and infrastructure limitations of hydrogen. And then following Ali, we have IEEFA's Director of Resource Planning, David Schlissel. David will use his many years of experience as a regulatory attorney and consultant on energy and utility issues to walk us through some blue hydrogen production scenarios and what he thinks about those. And after that, we'll conclude the presentations and we'll open up the floor for Q&A. So with that, I'd like to welcome Joanne. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all so much for having me. Again, I'm Joanne Kilgour, the Executive Director of the Ohio River Valley Institute, and we cover 4 states in the Appalachian region. So we cover Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. So I'm just going to share a little bit about what our states have been facing related to hydrogen hub development and some of the community considerations that are at play. So why are we talking about hydrogen hubs? For us, this has been a really kind of sudden onset and full-on program since the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law, and then even more so after the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act with some of the additional tax credits. But so the short version of the story is that Congress authorized the Department of Energy to create a regional clean hydrogen hub program. And this is essentially a competitive grant program to provide funding for regional hydrogen development. And one of the key elements is that at least 2 of these hydrogen hubs have to be in natural gas producing regions, of which our region is one. So this just kind of goes into a little bit more detail about the Department of Energy's strategy and the hydrogen roadmap, and provides a little bit of an outline of some of the potential regions that are vying for this funding. So what we're likely to see is up to a handful of grants, so it's unclear whether it will be 6 or 10, whether there will be combined applications or individual applications moving forward. But there's going to be about $7 billion of this funding allocated to these regional hubs, and then an additional $1 to $2 billion reserved for potential additional projects on top of that. And so, let's see. All right, so this just talks about where we are in the timeline. So it's like many things with the bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act. This has been happening on a very accelerated timeline relative to a lot of federal programs. So the announcement for the request for information for the hubs came out in February of last year. And now we've had responses to the RFIs have already concluded. The funding opportunity was issued in the fall of last year. There have been concept papers that were submitted by different applicants, and those concept papers have been reviewed. The Department of Energy provided encourage or discourage notifications to different projects. And one of the things that has been really circling this entire program is a lack of transparency. Part of this is due to the competitive nature of the grant program and also some sort of confidential business information or other confidential technical information that the Department of Energy has basically said that they're leaving it up to the discretion of the applicants how much information they share and on what timeline. And that includes whether or not a project received a discourage or encourage notification. So we don't actually have a complete inventory of which concept papers were encouraged or discouraged, other than if there were, individual applicants that decided to do a press release or make that public. So essentially, now all full applications have been submitted, and the Department of Energy has gone back to applicants with a series of questions. So they're in this sort of information sharing and negotiating phase where we expect that the official notifications will be made in the fall of this year. So again, a very accelerated timeline for a really significant program, but we should have more insight into which proposals were selected later this year. So we're talking about all of this, but what even is a hydrogen hub? This is a very sophisticated audience, so many of you are probably very familiar with this concept, but the general public, when they hear the term hydrogen hub, they really think that this is an isolated infrastructure build out, that maybe there's, kind of like a mall or like a strip mall kind of thing, but for hydrogen development. But really what we're talking about is a pretty vast and interconnected network of different kinds of infrastructure that could include everything from natural gas, hydrogen, and carbon pipelines to power plants and factories, end users, producers of hydrogen. I think when we talk about a hub, it sounds like a very limited and sort of geographically limited development. But when we actually think about what this infrastructure could mean, and as we dive into what some of the proposals for our region are, it's actually quite a vast build out. So to get into some detail about what we do know about the proposals in our region, and again, this is all just based on publicly available information that the applicants have decided to share. So I don't have any special insight into these. This is just information that we've compiled to try to help educate constituents in our region. This first one is from the state of Pennsylvania, and this is called the Decarbonization Network of Appalachia. The lead applicant for this is a public-private partnership, which is called the Team Pennsylvania Foundation, and they have been working closely with Shell. There was another partner, Equinor, but Equinor has pulled out of this proposal in favor of more development in the Gulf South. So what they're primarily looking at is a natural gas, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen pipeline network, as well as a significant build out of carbon capture infrastructure, both on power plants and industrial sources. Part of their proposal for the DNA2 hub, or the Decarbonization Network of Appalachia, includes a vast new build out of carbon pipelines across the state. So they're looking at really using their hydrogen hub application as a way to focus much more on the carbon capture side of the infrastructure. So the carbon that would be captured from hydrogen production would really amount to about less than 15% of the total amount of carbon that's proposed to be sequestered through this hub proposal. So they're focusing much more on carbon capture at power plants, building out this CO2 network, and part of this proposes 1,400 new pipeline miles that really would affect residents of Pennsylvania in almost every district. One of the things to note about this, kind of the scope of this proposal, is that currently the US only has 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines. So adding 1,400 additional miles in just one state is a very significant build out. And we have relatively limited experience with things like exposure studies or really understanding the kinds of regulatory and other frameworks that the state would need to have in place to make sure that the public could be adequately protected. So what is this really about? We're talking about lots of build out, we're talking about a lot of carbon dioxide, pipeline infrastructure, and we're talking about essentially more very familiar fossil fuel infrastructure build out. And the oil and gas companies in our region have been really forthcoming about the fact that they're making a play in the hydrogen space as a new market for shale gas. So this individual is Toby Race, the president of EQT, which is one of the largest natural gas producers in our region. And he has said in numerous publications, really in every venue that they can, that they see hydrogen as a significant new market and a significant play for their product. And again, we've heard a little bit about efforts to do greenwashing in the LNG space. EQT has kind of parallel tracks. They have an unleashing LNG strategy and they have a hydrogen strategy. So EQT is involved in a different proposal in our region, which is called the ARCH2, or the Appalachian Regional Clean Hydrogen Hub. This is anchored really in West Virginia and has been one of the most sophisticated proposals that we've seen come together. So it's being led by Battelle, the state of West Virginia, and then they have a really vast network of companies, academic institutions, and other businesses that have signed on to an MOU, and as part of signing on to their MOU, they also require a confidentiality agreement. So any members who have signed on to the MOU for this project are prohibited from sharing public information about the details of the proposal beyond what's included on their website. So this is, again, one of the most extensive proposals that we've seen, covering multiple states. They've already announced anchor projects. And so these are just 3 of the anchor projects that they've introduced. And you can see the kind of distribution of projects that they're projecting across our region. So again, touching Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. And it's hard to make predictions about which of these proposals is likely to be selected, but both Jennifer Granholm and Senator Manchin from West Virginia have made very positive statements about this particular proposal. So it seems like there's quite a lot of momentum behind this ARCH2 proposal. Let's see. There are a couple other proposals that touch on our region. One is the Great Lakes Clean Hydrogen Hub. That, again, is more in the Ohio part of our region with a little bit in Pennsylvania, and has more of a focus on nuclear or pink hydrogen, and is looking at industrial applications. So they have key partners including Cleveland Cliffs and Energy Harbor. And then there's another in sort of the eastern part of our region, so eastern part of Pennsylvania and New Jersey, the Mid-Atlantic Clean Hydrogen Hub. And this one has been a bit less developed and has evolved over time, but is focusing on primarily heavy industry and transportation. So one of the things that is really concerning to us is that these hydrogen hub promises are really taking on a very similar narrative approach as many previous proposed developments that really just benefit the gas industry, including the proposals for an Appalachian ethane storage hub, proposals for Appalachian petrochemical build out, and all the way back to the shale gas boom, where each of these things was a big grand vision with Department of Energy support, with American Chemistry Council council support that were supposed to revolutionize and completely revitalize the economy of Appalachia. And of course, the previous three, so the shale gas boom, the ethane storage hub, and the petrochemical renaissance, never materialized. There were individual one-off projects that maybe were developed, but we just have not seen the real economic delivery. And it's a challenge for us because so much of the political will, both from policymakers, economic development agencies, and our kind of regional sustainable development infrastructure is completely devoted to these visions. There's almost nothing else happening in the region that it has the same kind of weight and organization behind it in terms of securing a clean energy future. So we stand to lose not just this kind of false promise, but also the time and the resources that have been invested in building out these proposals when we know that there's, a much more shovel-ready, easy, clear pathway for our states to advance clean energy solutions. And there are a lot of economic problems with the blue hydrogen hub-based proposals in our region. I won't spend a lot of time talking about this because David will have that covered during his presentation, but just a note that, it's not just that if this hub vision were to come to fruition that it won't deliver on the economic promise to our local communities, but there are serious problems with the business model, even with the significant amount of tax credit opportunities that were passed through the Inflation Reduction Act. So we talked about the risk of the kind of economic risk. There's also a very significant environmental justice risk. So in previous sessions today, we've heard about kind of the Biden administration speaking out of both sides of its mouth. This is another example of that, where there's the Justice 40 announcement, Justice 40 principles, where 40% of the benefit from these federal programs are supposed to go toward justice communities. And in this case, the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council has stated very clearly that they do not believe that projects that either extend the lifespan of fossil fuel development or rely on carbon capture and sequestration will benefit the public. So that presents a serious problem when you have blue hydrogen hub proposals that are based very strongly on the use of carbon capture, the continued development of oil and gas resources, that how can you sort of reconcile these programs where you have to see an environmental justice benefit, you have to see a community benefit, but also you're doing the exact kinds of projects that the primary advisory network that you've established is saying will not benefit their communities. So we have economic risk, we have environmental justice risk, and we're seeing, so this and again, I'm breaking all these PowerPoint rules with having very wordy slides, but the DNA hydrogen hub proposal, so the proposal coming from Pennsylvania, in their publicly available summary, they have stated that they're essentially making the case for environmental justice based on a contribution to GDP. And we're seeing this in many different communities, and it's extremely concerning to us because we know that GDP is not an indicator of community health, and it's really a reflection of the proposal entities deciding on behalf of communities what's in their best interest and framing that in the environmental justice portion or community benefits portion of their application, rather than actually taking the lead and thinking about what communities need. So, we've heard quotes from community members that's like, what good is a carbon capture installation in my neighborhood that doesn't have a grocery store, right? Like, how is that a community benefit to me? And it's not just that there are economic or environmental concerns. This is really, our lives in our region are literally at stake. So I just share this report because I think it helps to summarize the risk that our communities are confronted with additional fracking. So in the US, 7.5% of counties have a cancer risk of greater than 1 in 1 million. This little map represents the most heavily fracked counties in our region, and 100% of those counties see a cancer risk of greater than 1 in 1 million. And in Ohio, it is only the fracking counties that see that risk. So, we have a really significant public health threat in addition to all of the economic and environmental concerns that we're faced with. So thank you very much. And now you'll hear from Ali.
Thanks, Joanne. Good afternoon. So what I'm going to be talking about is primarily engineering issues, right? The value proposition of hydrogen is, well, you burn it, you get energy, and all you create in terms of emissions is water vapor. So it sounds fantastic. But when you start drilling down into this, there are some significant constraints. In California, the utilities have been pushing really hard to start blending hydrogen into existing natural gas. The thought process is, well, if you can get 20% hydrogen into natural gas, then you've cut down your emissions by 20%. And then as you increase the amount of hydrogen, pretty soon you're not generating any carbon dioxide, any harmful emissions. And that's great. That, from an upper level, top-down view, is a valid position. But there are engineering constraints. And there are constraints, as David will talk about, on how you get that hydrogen, whether it's blue, green, pink, and then there are environmental justice issues. But from an engineering perspective, when you start blending hydrogen or when you start transporting hydrogen, are you going to use the existing infrastructure? And can the existing infrastructure actually convey that hydrogen safely? And nobody knows the answer to that. So the proposition right now, given that the existing natural gas piping network within the United States is 3 million miles, the thought is that we can just use existing networks and carry the hydrogen. And that is the premise, but it doesn't work that well. The reason it doesn't work that way is because natural gas pipelines vis-a-vis hydrogen pipelines are built to different engineering standards. And there's a reason for those engineering standards, and there are significant differences across those standards, right? So there are differences pertaining to materials of construction, to the types of fittings, and even the welds. The hydrogen molecule is much, much smaller than the methane molecule, the natural gas, the primary constituent of natural gas. So if you end up transporting hydrogen in natural gas pipelines, you have the risk for increased leakage, and you also have the risk for increased diffusion through the metal, which can then harm or mess up the metal to the point that you have a catastrophic failure. In a technical term, that's hydrogen embrittlement, and it happens in petrochemical refineries which have hydrogen. And if you're now transporting hydrogen through natural gas networks, you're going to have explosions which have not been experienced, releases and then explosions which have not been experienced previously. So that's one constraint. How do you address this? Well, you address this with positive materials identification. You go ahead and understand what constitutes your pipeline networks, and if you're using the correct materials, you can prevent these kind of incidents. But the problem is that existing pipeline networks are notoriously poorly understood. So in terms of what comprises the networks, what components were put in, it's not very clear. And PMI on existing pipe, which is already in the ground, is painful. Petrochemical refineries already have a challenge. They're required to do it now because of regulations and standards, but they have enough of a challenge doing it with piping, which is not buried. And now when you start talking about doing PMI, positive materials identification on pipeline, which is buried, it's expensive, it's painful, and it requires a lot of efforts. And it requires impeccable record keeping once you've done the PMI. These are all issues that industry has had challenges with. Now, there's another factor, and that has to do with energy density. We're going to be talking about that, right? So hydrogen has very different transport characteristics than natural gas. They're gases, but that's about it, right? It has a volumetric energy density which is about 3x lower than methane. What that means is that if you're trying to get the same amount of energy, you either have to increase the pressure by a factor of 3, or you have to increase the flow rate by a factor of 3, assuming you want to get the same amount of energy through. So what that means is when you increase the pressure, you also increase the pressure drop. And if you increase the velocity, so you just pump more through the same diameter, well, now you start eroding the metal because you're putting such a high velocity through it. Both of these are constraints. This also means that hydrogen requires a lot more energy to pump through the pipelines. So if you're going to use the same networks, you will need more compressor stations. So when you pump natural gas through a network, every 50 miles or so, you have a compressor station which boosts the pressure. Now you're going to need compressor stations which are a lot closer, or you will need thicker pipe, which means that if you're going to try and use the same networks, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. You can't just use existing pipe. That is a little optimistic. Okay, so then the conversation moves to liquid hydrogen. And the thought is, well, there's more than one way to skin a cat. What if we just liquefy it? We did it with methane for LNG. Why don't we just create liquid hydrogen transportation solutions? And that'll work to a point. So hydrogen hazards can be grouped into 3 general categories, right? There's physiological, asphyxiation, cryogenic burns; physical, and we've talked about damage mechanisms, hydrogen embrittlement. I'm going to talk about the chemical hazard in a little bit, but let's focus on liquid hydrogen. So liquid hydrogen is really cold. So LNG is about negative 160 C. Liquid hydrogen is negative 253 degrees centigrade. And that makes a big difference, because at that lower temperature, you actually start liquefying oxygen and you start liquefying nitrogen. So now when you're talking about liquid hydrogen, liquid LNG, metal is fine, there's no liquid nitrogen, there's no liquid oxygen, the metal can survive it. Liquid hydrogen, the metal doesn't really survive it all that well. And because you're creating liquid oxygen, you end up with permeation of liquid oxygen into the metal. You can initiate brittle fracture. Liquid oxygen, in the event there's a leak, can cause, can increase the flammable risk, because now you end up with flammable mixtures. You need oxygen to create a flammable cloud at locations which are far away from the leak, because the liquid disperses. And there's another issue. Even with your best insulation, the gas losses, this phenomenon called boil-off gas, BOG, is 10 times higher than LNG. Now on a ship, it's easy. You expect that you're going to have boil-off gas, you pipe the boil-off gas to your engine, and you start burning it. But if you don't know how to utilize the boil-off gas, you're going to lose about 10% of the hydrogen as emissions. And we're going to talk about that in not this slide, but the next one. There are certain end user considerations also, right? It is true that hydrogen, when it burns, is producing water vapor, lower greenhouse gas emissions, but the flame temperature is higher. So it burns hotter. And when it burns hotter, it creates more NOx. So we have to be concerned. We want to cut down on carbon dioxide, but we don't really want NOx, because NOx creates smog. I live in Los Angeles. Smog for us is something we're just now getting to overcome, but during the summer, you can still see the brown haze. So if we start burning lots of hydrogen, it's going to get smoggier. And smog also means acid rain, which is a term some of you might remember from the 1970s. So there are challenges that have to be addressed. The flammability range is much wider. So methane is combustible between the range of 5% and 15%, right? So if it's less than 5% methane, there's no fire risk. If it's more than 15% methane, you just have to make sure that the concentration doesn't drop down to less than 15%, but you can manage that. For hydrogen, the flammability limit is between 3% and 75%. So pretty much it means you have a hydrogen leak, it's going to be flammable, and that's a problem. Another little issue is that when hydrogen burns, it's invisible. Methane is a blue flame, hydrogen is invisible. In fact, what industry does to figure out whether a hydrogen flare is burning, is they go and wave a straw broom at the stack, because they can't see it. And nobody's going to go close enough to feel the radiation, so they just wave a straw broom, and if it ignites, that means the hydrogen is burning. But a customer who doesn't see a flame is going to have increased risk for accidents. So that's a challenge that needs to be addressed. But the biggest issue, which is flying completely under the radar, except for a Princeton study which I've cited here, is that hydrogen, even though when it burns and creates water vapor, does not mean that it is completely harmless. Water is generally harmless, water in the atmosphere and hydrogen in the atmosphere, not so much. And the reason is hydrogen reacts beautifully with the hydroxyl, the OH radical. Okay? The OH radical exists in the stratosphere and it serves a very important purpose. All the fugitive methane emissions that occur, the hydroxyl radical scavenges those. So the reason methane emissions, if you look at the global warming potential of methane, the reason it goes down from 80 in 20 years to 28 in 100 years is because the hydroxyl radical destroys the methane in the stratosphere. You put hydrogen in the stratosphere, the hydroxyl radical immediately gravitates to the hydrogen. It wants to make water vapor, which means that methane is going to be living in the atmosphere for a lot longer if there is a lot more hydrogen available in the stratosphere. So now think about this. You're trying to increase the amount of hydrogen that you're consuming on the ground. Inevitably, that's going to release more hydrogen into the atmosphere. What that means is methane, which is also being released into the atmosphere, either through natural sources, dairy farms, emissions from hydrates, because we're warming up the atmosphere, we're not going to be able to destroy it. So initially, the study that Princeton did, which I thought was reasonable, is that you can actually estimate the global warming potential of hydrogen. And it is about 33, so 1 ton of hydrogen is equivalent to 33 tons of carbon dioxide, plus or minus 11. There's a lot of variation here. And this assumes that we know how much hydrogen is being released. And the wild card here is that it's per ton of hydrogen. So we know, we have an intuitive idea of how much methane is being released. We know it's a very bad thing. But if a lot more hydrogen is released, 3x the amount of methane which is being released currently, we will not get any gains whatsoever, because the global warming potential of hydrogen is 33. The global warming potential of methane is 80. These are 20-year time periods. You increase the amount of hydrogen which you put in the atmosphere because of leaks, because of poor equipment, which we've talked about, you're back to where you started. So hydrogen hubs are wonderful. They would work, but that's the problem. This is just a slide I'm teeing up for David. For a gas which is colorless and odorless, there's a lot of colors that are associated with it. Blue hydrogen is something which is being talked about. Green is actually pretty good. I love green hydrogen. Electrolysis, producing hydrogen, if you can prevent leaks, that sort of works for certain applications, steel and cement. Blue hydrogen, which is steam methane reforming, well, David loves it. He's going to talk a lot more about it. All yours.
They haven't set me up too much, have they? I pressed the green one? Yes. Okay. My colleague Annika, June, and I have been working for 4 or 5 months on an analysis of how dirty blue hydrogen is. Blue hydrogen is producing hydrogen from fossil fuels, natural gas, and coal. We're not focusing on green or any of the other colors, just blue from fossil fuels. That's the title of the report. It's not going to be released for about another month, so I'm not going to tell you any of the detailed results, but I'm going to show you, and you're going to have a good sense of where we're going. As you listen to me and you think about blue hydrogen, I want you to read these 3 quotes from famous people. Actually, I haven't heard of the first, and I work with the third, but the middle guy's famous. Hydrogen's not a fuel, it's a cult. Michael Lee Breck, it will take until 2030 to rein in the current bout of hydrogen mania. Cult deprogramming takes time. And then Dennis Wamstead, who I think probably just ran out of the room in the back, my colleague said, called me one day and said, you know, the more I read about blue hydrogen, the worse it looks. And that's probably a cleaned up version of what he actually said. These are the key takeaways from our forthcoming report. Blue hydrogen is very dirty from a climate point of perspective in terms of how much CO2 equivalent is emitted per unit of hydrogen produced. It will be even dirtier when the carbon capture doesn't work as proponents claim it will. And at the same time that they're emitting huge amounts of CO2 equivalents, the oil and gas industry will be receiving, well, I put in billions, but it's really tens of billions of dollars in tax subsidies every year, even as their blue hydrogen projects are responsible for tremendous emissions of CO2 equivalents. 3 technologies. Steam methane reforming is the current mode used around the world. Autothermal reforming it's not new, but it's going to be it's the one that seems to be the new standard. The difference is that with autothermal reforming, it produces a stream of CO2 that's more highly concentrated, easier to use. Coal gasification, I'm not going to go into details. It's a bad idea any way you look at it, except if you happen to own a coal mine. This is straight out of the model. Congress is determined in their infinite, or maybe it's zero, 1 over infinity, zero wisdom, that a model called GREET that was developed by Argonne National Lab. GREET stands for Greenhouse Gas, Regulated Emissions, and Energy and Transport, GREET. It models emissions, as you can tell from the name. The results in scientific terms are always presented in kilograms of CO2e, that's for equivalent, per kilogram of hydrogen produced. Now, it suddenly struck me, I only went to 2 engineering schools in my life, that using kilograms is not like normal in the US, but the same relationship between exists if you talk tons. The proposed federal clean hydrogen production standard, which I'll get to in a minute, is 4.0 kilograms, but I'm talking in tons from now on. Tons of CO2 emitted per ton of hydrogen produced. You can see that without any kind of carbon capture, the numbers are far, far above that. Far above it. Either if you look on a 20-year time frame or a 100-year time frame. So how do you make dirty blue hydrogen clean? I was going to call these Schlissel 7 simple steps, but I figured it doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, for making blue hydrogen a clean and low carbon fuel. First is you repeat the words hydrogen, low carbon, and clean as often as you can. No matter what the question you're asked, what the context is, when you put your kids to sleep, you make sure the last thing they hear is blue hydrogen, clean, low carbon. Keep the public in the dark about specific blue hydrogen projects and keep your decision-making process as opaque as you can. Joanne talked about the fact that these participants in the various hydrogen hub proposals have to keep their information secret. What that means is that the Department of Energy is not going to tell you what they're going to fund with billions of our dollars until they finally decide what projects, and they're not going to tell us all about these projects. Now, if blue hydrogen were really clean, you'd think they'd be a little more honest. Okay, there's the GREET model that's mandated by Congress in the Inflation Reduction Act. Again, we're going to talk in tons because people can understand that. So how do you make it clean? Well, you assume that you have low methane emissions upstream. Ali talked about that. You assume that you capture a huge amount, all or almost all of the CO2 that's produced at the production facility. You focus only on the 100-year global warming potentials. If we go backwards, you can see the 100-year potential GWPs are lower than the 20 years. That's because methane is, as Ali explained, has a shorter life in the atmosphere. And you ignore a lot of the emissions from producing hydrogen. Okay? You ignore hydrogen, the emissions from hydrogen, of hydrogen. The fifth simple step is say that you're conducting a life cycle analysis, okay? Life cycle pops in your head, right? Cradle to grave, because that's what they do with people. No, here life cycle goes cradle to the production facility. They ignore downstream effects. So that's how you make it clean, is by just ignoring some of the emissions. Get the media to cut advocates who disagree with you out of the national dialogue. That's simple. Last and not least, don't fret, because the DOE has indicated that the government still will fund your project if you're an oil and gas company or some ally, even if they don't meet this 4.0 standard, as long as they demonstrably aid the achievement of the clean hydrogen production standard, whatever that means. Since they're not going to tell us what's in the proposals or what their decision-making process has been, we'll never know. Okay, if you do those things, a 1% methane leak rate, which is really, you assume that, 100-year global warming potentials, high CO2 carbon capture rates, and no global warming potential for hydrogen. So you only look at the brown bars, the blue bars are pre-modeling, no CCS. The brown bars are with carbon capture of 92% for coal gasification, up to 96.2% for the SMR. It gets confusing. SMR, you hear coming out of my mouth today, stands for steam methane reforming. If you come to our nuclear side meeting tomorrow morning, I'm going to talk about SMRs, and it stands for small modular reactors. It's not real, they're not really small, but they got it in the name. Okay, so this is how they're going to come and they're going to talk about, the model shows that blue hydrogen is clean. This is what I discussed before about how in the GREET model, they only include what's inside the red box. Don't worry about all the words. It's just the steps. It's the upstream emissions from the production of the fossil fuel to the production facility, electricity generation, the emissions at the production facility, what you do with the CO2, that's included. Downstream's not. Now in the, the bipartisan, it's BIL, infrastructure law, they have an even easier to meet standard. They only look at what happens at the production facility. And if you meet a standard of 2.0 kilograms or tons per kilogram of hydrogen produced, no matter how much you leak, no matter how much terrible the emissions are upstream or downstream, you're great, you're funded. Ali talked about methane. I'll skip that. Now, carbon intensity, if you change the input assumptions of this model, which we've done, remember that the carbon intensity, the higher it is, the worse it is. If you assume 1% methane leakage, it's the 3.4. I'm just looking at the two bars closest to the left. 3.4 tons of CO2 emitted per ton of hydrogen produced. That's on a 100-year basis. 20 years, it's already up to 5.5. And you can see is the assumed methane leak rate goes up. We believe that the 2.6% is the most reasonable. An analysis by Professor Horwath at Cornell, who spoke at our conference last fall, justifies and supports the 2.6%. It's supported by many recent aerial and satellite surveys of methane leaks at natural gas production gas fields. Okay, the last three I'm going to go, so let me go back. We're changing other things with the model. So if you look at this This is the bottom of where our carbon intensity of blue hydrogen is. We think it's going to be significantly higher than this. Professor Jacobson from Stanford wrote a paper back in 2021 on how green is blue hydrogen, and his results were somewhere in the ballpark of 16, 18 tons of CO2e per ton of hydrogen produced, if I remember the number correctly. So ours are going to be upward of here. Let me jump. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry about that. It's the end of the day. The U.S. government accepts the myth of high carbon capture rates, and it's a myth. They assume these 3 rates for the 3 technologies I showed you before. The government assumes they will be achieved immediately. You turn it on and it runs really well. And it does it year in and year out, decade in and decade out. This is our real world capture. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. I have to keep 7 or 8. It's late in the day, I can't count well. The best one is 78 to 80% up in Alberta at the Shell's Project Quest, but that doesn't include the entire project. If you include the entire project in Canada, the highest is 68% from a hydrogen production facility. The Air Products facility in Texas, somewhere between 40 and 50% capture. Air Liquide, I think it's in Normandy in France. I apologize, Jonathan, for my French accent there. Is 60%, and that's an estimate from the U.S. Department of Energy. Nowhere near the 90s that the carbon capture, gas, coal industries, DOE, and some environmental groups push. So the technology is not proven at all. Now, when they talk about a 92% capture rate, they only talk about, or 95, around the power plant. If it's a power plant, they only talk about the power plant. Okay? So again, upstream and downstream emissions, they don't care about. Carbon capture doesn't touch those. Now, I did an analysis of a life cycle analysis of a proposed coal plant near where Mr. Singer there lives in New Mexico that included the methane emissions from the coal, the mining of the coal burned in the power plant. They wanted to add on a carbon capture facility that would capture 95% of the CO2 from just the power plant, okay? So I added in the methane emitted by the mining. What happens is your 95% becomes 72% for the whole life cycle. The plant, while it would capture 6 or 7 million tons of CO2 and E, would still have emitted 2 to 3 million tons of CO2e a year. And for emitting this amount of CO2, their reward was they'd get somewhere between they would have gotten, the plant's been retired, they would have gotten somewhere between $440 to $580 million a year from us, the taxpayers. If you want to know about our analysis, tune in late July. For more information, you can contact me before then. Thanks.
Thank you all. You all did a wonderful job. We're going to open it up the mic. Please come up and ask a question. I can kick us off here while somebody come on. Yours will be much better than mine.
a wonderful session. Thanks to the panelists. My question is a small question addressed to Madam Joanne. I'm sorry. The dilemma is hydrogen has a great merit of being a distributed form of energy, which means you could produce anywhere, consume at the locally, and thereby you save the transportation cost and you become energy independent. That is one argument in favor of hydrogen. But the hydrogen hub concept goes that you create a hub at various places and then you aggregate both the consumers and the producers at one place. Perhaps in USA it has historically happened and therefore you have 7 or so many hubs. But do you think that the same concept of hub will work in other countries where they are at the inception of adoption curve? I hope I am correct in my, I am clear in my question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I can just start and then if others would like to chime in, but I think, I think what you're describing is sort of, there's one way of thinking about, for example, green hydrogen production, where it could be on site with a very niche application and it would be limited, right? So it would be producing hydrogen from truly clean sources for a specific application at a specific site. But we really have not been seeing that as part of our US-based hydrogen hub sort of race to the bottom. And so I think more likely what we're seeing is, again, this vast network of pipeline infrastructure and other kinds of facilities spanning many counties across many states. And it's just hard to see either the environmental or economic justification for that kind of development. But again, I focus on a very specific region, so I don't have the same kind of international perspective that you may have, or Ali or David that you may be able to provide.
Two things. One is you got to think of the hydrogen hub idea is a continued life of coal and gas plants. I mean, it's subsidies to the coal and oil and gas industries. Second is if they build all the pipelines that they're going to need. Now, Joanne and Ali mentioned something about hydrogen. You're going to need methane pipeline, natural gas pipelines to some coal plants if they become production facilities. I mean, driving the interstate between here and New York, Interstate 80, it's going to be like going over speed bumps in a schoolyard, in a school driveway. They're going to need 20,000 miles of pipes, been estimated, just for the carbon dioxide produced. I mean, it's not feasible. I mean, I don't think it will happen. Some will happen. A lot of our money will go down the drain and will happen. But we'll see. I think there are problems. I mean, you look overseas. Come tomorrow morning, my colleague, at lunchtime, our carbon capture side meeting. My colleague Grant is going to talk about his recent report on geological problems with storing captured CO2 under the North Sea, which is claimed to be a success. It's not.
But having said that, if you use green hydrogen, you solve one challenge. All the dirtiness of blue hydrogen goes away. But a recurring theme in renewables is, well, how do you store the excess energy? And people have talked about storing pumped energy, so pumping up water and storing that. Well, electrolysis, converting it to green hydrogen, is another form of energy storage. And if you can utilize that close in for a cement plant or for steel production, there may well be benefits associated with that. It just has to be thought through and implemented correctly. So it's not that hydrogen doesn't have a role. It has a role, but it has to be done intelligently.
Yes.
I'm interested, Ali, what's your thought about using hydrogen to create other fuels like ammonia or kerosene or something of that nature?
So we need ammonia to make ammonium nitrate. We need ammonia for fertilizer production, right, as part of the food security. And ammonia already, the Haber process, which is the most widely used, uses hydrogen. The key question there, which I would support, is can you use green hydrogen as opposed to blue hydrogen, and certainly not gray hydrogen. Gray is
what we use right now.
Yeah. So, and I completely agree with David's concerns about the efficiency of carbon capture. But if you're creating solar energy farms and you have excess energy, you can use electrolysis of water, store the hydrogen and use it nearby where you don't transmit it over long distances, and there you can substitute, and that's a good thing. I think the same goes for e-kerosene, the same thing goes for methanol. Just realize that when you burn the methanol or when you burn the e-kerosene, you're still going to have emissions. So
it's not really solving the
it's
problem.
not fully solving the problem, exactly.
Somebody, oh, come on up, just
Don't be shy.
I'm Sarah Lutz from Kilgour. I really appreciated the reality check you gave Ali about the technological feasibility of using existing gas infrastructure for hydrogen and hydrogen gas blending. One other aspect of the proposed build out in the US has been, kind of the end use in sectors that aren't necessarily compatible with hydrogen.
Ali will repeat the question once you give it. Go ahead, keep on going.
That aren't necessarily compatible or efficient uses of hydrogen. So the Hydrogen Hub program mandates demonstration in areas like commercial and residential heating, and allows for gas blending and gas turbines with hydrogen. So I was wondering if y'all could speak to the technological compatibility of these proposed end uses as well as consumer safety.
Yeah, so I touched a little bit upon that, and yes, so the question is, assuming, and I'm going to paraphrase, assuming you can get hydrogen to the end user, are there any constraints at the end user stage to using hydrogen? Did I capture the gist of the question? Yes, I did. And yes, there are constraints. I talked about the straw test. I'd actually teed it up. When hydrogen burns, you can't see the flame. Hydrogen is odorless. Methane is odorless, but we put mercaptan in methane, and now everyone knows natural gas has a characteristic odor, right? You're going to have to figure out an odorant for hydrogen which does not mess up the climate, and you're going to have to retrofit all of your burners because you're dealing with a lower energy density and a hotter flame. These are all challenges that can be solved, but they haven't been thought about. So everyone said, oh, hydrogen, it creates water vapor, it's a panacea for carbon dioxide. But what about all these engineering challenges? They're not insurmountable, but they haven't been thought about. And at the very least, you're going to have to change your burner orifices because your current burner flames are set up for methane, and you're going to have to understand that you're going to have a different flame altogether. A hotter flame which is burning with a different energy density, and that will require a process. No? Okay.
Please.
David? Go on.
Hello, I'm Mike O'Boyle. I'm the Director of Electricity Policy at an organization called Energy Innovation, Climate and Clean Energy Policy Research Organization in San Francisco. David, I totally agree, blue hydrogen, not a climate solution. And I've heard a lot of people agree that under the right constraints, green hydrogen can be a useful climate solution if it's put to the right end uses. Right now, in Europe and in the US, what counts as green hydrogen is being actively litigated. And I'm curious, for those who are watching companies that are saying we will do green hydrogen, how can they evaluate the climate, like whether it's a climate aligned strategy for green hydrogen or whether it's yet another greenwashing scheme?
I've got a quick answer for you. Well, I don't know how they're going to do their analysis, but they're going to use the GREET model. And they're not going to look at any of the hydrogens. They're going to pretend Ali's concerns don't exist.
For the emissions.
For the emissions. And my concern about green hydrogen, which I actually learned from Tom Singer, is the water. I mean, if you're in a place like New Mexico and you need water for agriculture, where are you going to get enough water to do green hydrogen? So I think there are places you do it, as with, you know, the uses, Ali's point about the uses. You pick how much hydrogen you need to do the things you can't do another way, another clean way. I mean, you've written great stuff about it. I've followed your stuff. I think you just have to do it smartly, something the US hasn't really got a track record doing.
So I personally think ammonia, cement, and steel have the most potential, but even that has to be done carefully. But if you do it carefully, there is the potential to get some savings.
This isn't directly responsive to your question, but something that we're seeing in the proposals from our region is a very clear shift since the full applications were submitted to the proposal entities saying, well, we're going to start with blue hydrogen, but our intention is to transition to green hydrogen long term. So even some of the proposals that are currently relying on a blue hydrogen based hub model, where I think maybe because of different political or other pressures are starting to build in this narrative that, oh, don't worry, it's just a bridge, right? It's just a bridge to green hydrogen. And I think that's another just trend for us all to be watching out for while even the green hydrogen question is being litigated.
And if you believe that, I have a bridge between Manhattan and Brooklyn I'd like to sell you.
The current cost of gray hydrogen is about $2 per kilogram, and green is around 6, 7. I think forecasts assume that around 2030, 2035 they could converge. But that's based on LCOE of countries which are very low, so LCOE, so I was speaking about Middle East, Africa, maybe Chile, so number of countries which will be able to produce green hydrogen at $2 or $3 per kilowatt will be very limited. And the off-taker will be most likely in Europe, maybe in the US. I don't see the problem, but it seems like the business model will be like green hydrogen will be produced in maybe Saudi Arabia, Namibia, Mauritania, Chile, and exported to Europe. Germany has already signed a deal with Namibia to buy some hydrogen. I don't see it as a problem, but do you see that this could be the business model looking forward?
Can I take this?
Oh, you have to.
Okay. So we talked about emissions, right? We talked about boil-off gas. So if you produce green hydrogen where you have a great surplus of solar energy, you can actually produce it for around $2. Economies of scale will come in Moore's law, or some derivative of Moore's law will.
Namibia is a good example. Namibia is a good example.
Namibia is a good example. Even California is a good example, believe it or not, right? The challenge becomes in transporting hydrogen, because when you transport hydrogen, you're going to have leaks. And when you have leaks, you're going to have global warming potential associated with the greenhouse gas component of that gas. And liquid hydrogen, with its constraints related to boil-off gas, is something that hasn't been studied. Princeton started looking at it, but I think the reason is because people have, and David alluded to this, people don't consider the downstream emissions concerns, right? So that analysis will need to be completed before you embark on transporting hydrogen. And if it turns out that you cannot transport hydrogen without leakage, then perhaps regions that do not have a surplus of solar energy shouldn't be looking at hydrogen at all. So,
How about retrofitting pipeline dedicated only to hydrogen?
if the retrofitting is done correctly and safely, hydrogen can be transported, but you have to, the model that you run to determine whether net this is a benefit to the environment has to assume leakage will occur. So you can't assume that there's going to be no leakage. That's too optimistic.
My nightmare is that there are some really large hydrogen production facilities. Air Products wants to build one in southern Louisiana, produce 750 million cubic feet of hydrogen every day. Exxon is proposing one in eastern Texas, 1 billion standard cubic feet a day of hydrogen. How are we going to know how much they're emitting? We're going to have to listen to Exxon telling us how much they're emitting. I mean, it's going to be self-reporting. Can we trust them? I don't think so. And is the government ever going to have the backbone to shut one of these massive projects down if they're emitting huge amounts of CO2 equivalent? I don't think so. So we got to try to stop them before they get built to the extent we can.
We're almost out of time, but I'd like to ask Joanne, are you seeing something as far as on the jobs front? Do you think that policy will have some type of measurement in there to measure what types of jobs are created, or is it going to be, we don't want to measure them because it's not going to end up being what we promised all this time? I mean, what are you seeing there?
So we have not been seeing any commitments to actually do the after the fact jobs assessments. Honestly, we see a lot of input-output modeling and things that are, very similar projections that we've seen for example, the petrochemical industry or shale gas development before that. And the models just haven't borne out in reality. So we're seeing, the counties that have the most fracking, for example, in our region, are lagging the state and the nation in almost all of the indicators related to number of jobs, individual income, child poverty. And so it's very likely that the hydrogen development will result in that same outcome because they're capital intensive and not labor intensive industries. So it's, there's really not a lot of mystery there. We've seen it happen with all the previous promises that haven't delivered. And there's really the only accountability that we've seen on the back end has been from organizations like IEEFA.
Great. Well, with that, I'd like to thank all three of you. It's been very, very insightful. Thank you.
You guys agree.